From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. As the Trump administration intensifies export restrictions on China, particularly in advanced semiconductor technologies, U.S. companies are facing mounting pressure. In this high-stakes environment, American chip giant NVIDIA is reportedly set to launch its B30 CPU in China this July. The chip is believed to be specifically designed to bypass Washington's increasingly stringent AI export controls. Tailored for a market under growing strain, the B30's release could significantly reshape the global semiconductor landscape. It raises critical questions, though, especially in terms of implications for AI innovation. And how will it impact the escalating U.S.-China tech rivalry? Also, what does it signal about the evolving balance of geopolitical power in this digital age? Now, to break it all down, we're pleased to have a panel of guests to discuss all these questions. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Paul S. Triolo, partner and senior vice president for China and tech policy lead from DGA Group. From Beijing, China, we have Andy Mok, senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. And from Shanghai, we have Professor Shen Yi, director of the International Research Institute of Global Cyberspace Governance at Fudan University. Professor Shen Yi, let me go to you first. This sounds like a welcoming gesture expressed by Jensen Huang and NVIDIA on the part of the United States tech firms to be able to export and produce this certain type of a chip to China. But we know that it is not the most sophisticated chip. It is not the most advanced chip. What do you make of NVIDIA's decision to export B30 CPU to China this July?
B30 GPU produced by NVIDIA, it's kind of compromise actions for this company to making a very tough decision during this very sensitive age, which means NVIDIA need to balance its market interest and the requirement from the U.S. government, which restrict to export the most advanced AI chips to China. But frankly speaking, because United States draw a very thin line, the red line is very thin, it means that if these chips is qualified to export to China, that means it will be less competitive in the market. Actually, if you inquire consulting with those inside peoples, they will tell you the technical aspect of these new design chips is not that advanced, especially comparing to those China-made chips represented by those AI chips from Huawei companies. It will be difficult for these B30 chips to ensure that NVIDIA can continue its market advantages inside China, unless the U.S. government builds some modification to its restrict policies. Otherwise, in future, with the rising of the China-made chips inside China, those NVIDIA-made specified for China chips will be less and less competitive in the market.
Professor Shen, very quickly, as you pointed out that insiders say that this type of B30 CPU is even less advanced, less sophisticated in some aspects than China's own Huawei chips, then what good to be had by importing and having this chip for China?
Frankly speaking, no reason. It's just kind of for NVIDIA company, it's a very reasonable choice because they want to they cannot afford the risk that they completely withdraw from China's market. But from China's side, maybe for some small companies, for those companies who have a minor requirement for these AI chips on the sophisticated areas, while at the same time, maybe their applications is heavily depending on these NVIDIA CUDA ecosystems. These companies will need to import these chips to sustain their business or their development. Otherwise, maybe more and more companies will have to transfer their depending from the NVIDIA to Huawei so that they can get more advanced and sophisticated AI chips to running a more bigger area and models in the future.
Okay, let me turn to you, Paul, in Washington, D.C. Why would NVIDIA export this particular type of chips to China at this point in time?
Earlier this year, there was discussion within the U.S. government, and late last year, of changing again the performance parameters to capture the H20. Again, NVIDIA had gone to a lot of trouble to redesign these GPUs to meet and comply with the U.S. export controls. And so what happened, though, in April was the companies, NVIDIA and Intel and AMD, received what are called letters, is-informed letters, telling them that there were going to be restrictions coming on the H20. And so far, though, we don't know what the new parameter is that is restricted. Typically, after these letters are issued, the Commerce Department will come out with a very specific rule which will define what the performance parameters are that would require licenses with a presumption of denial of the licenses. So we still don't know that for the H20. So now we have NVIDIA saying they're going to redesign another of their GPUs to comply with a rule that we don't really know what the rule is. Now, my speculation is that probably the new rule will require that NVIDIA not incorporate high bandwidth memory into its GPUs that are sold to China. But again, I'm just speculating on that because we don't know what the actual parameters are. We don't know what NVIDIA is designing to comply with. And so it's hard to make a judgment about what exactly the performance parameters of the B30 are going to be, and therefore how useful it will be to Chinese companies. But Professor Shen is correct in saying that it's probably going to be obviously more limited in terms of performance than even the H20. And if it's not using high bandwidth memory, for example, then it may not be suitable at all for training. It still could be useful for things like inference. And again, yes, many of the companies in China that are using NVIDIA GPUs are sort of tied into the NVIDIA ecosystem, particularly the CUDA language and support environment, which is used for acceleration and is widely used all over the world by AI model developers. So we're sort of in an interesting position where we don't really know exactly what the B30 is. But we know that NVIDIA is committed to the China market because companies like NVIDIA and even AMD and Intel, other companies whose products require a lot of support, are eager to remain in the China market so they can support their existing installed base, which in China or for NVIDIA is considerable, not just in AI, but for vehicles. So anyway, so I think it's a very important to note that we got here through a series of steps. The last step is not really clear exactly what it will entail, but we'll probably find out soon.
Now, Andy, you have been a China tech observer for a very, very long time. What do you make of NVIDIA's decision to launch this B30 here in China?
So first of all, from NVIDIA's perspective, this is very, very profitable. So their margins are astronomical. And as you mentioned, China's an enormous market for them. At one point, I think they had more than 90% market share. Now it's fallen to 50% or less. The second reason is strategic. As Jensen Huang has said, if you do not compete in the China market, you're giving space to companies like Huawei to develop globally competitive alternatives, which could be in the long term an existential threat for NVIDIA. So that's what we have going on from the NVIDIA side. Now, why are Chinese companies buying this? So even though the hardware, the chips themselves are not as high performance, I'll use a very old school example here. So if you've been using PCs with Intel processors and a Windows operating system, you're trained, you're used to, you're efficient at using these. And this is what NVIDIA offers, I think, as the professor and as Paul alluded to, that NVIDIA does not just sell chips. They sell an entire system, including CUDA, which is a software package, and also a lot of software libraries as well, that makes the engineers, the people that work on these, use these NVIDIA chips much more productive. So there's still a very powerful incentive for Chinese businesses to use NVIDIA chips. Now, the wrench here, the monkey wrench here, is that the U.S. government keeps changing the goalpost. So it would not be surprising at all is that we may see 6 months from now, maybe sooner, new regulations that ban this latest iteration. And I want to make a quick point here, Guan, I think is super, super important. It's important to focus on these components, but this really is a systems engineering problem, meaning that it's a transdisciplinary, integrative, holistic project developing world-class AI that can be implemented at the enterprise and at the consumer level. And this is a skill set that China has excelled at. Making long-term plans, breaking them down, where you're incorporating not just technology, manufacturing, policy, finance, et cetera, in an adaptive way. So this is, again, why I think despite these, I would call them road bumps, that the U.S. has thrown to try to slow down China's technological rise in artificial intelligence, we've seen astonishing breakthroughs.
Exactly. Professor Shen Yi, Huawei CEO Ren Zhengfei recently said this. He said that China can achieve advanced computing through chip stacking and clustering, despite U.S. restrictions and export control regimes. And guess what? NVIDIA's Jensen Huang echoed that view. How do you assess their assessment, and really, how can China carve out its own path when it comes to high-tech advancement?
The most difficult part of the development of China's own version of this AI, either hardware and software, definitely is not a technical problems, but a market problems. Because China is a developing countries and the United States is a developed countries. So the U.S. company like NVIDIA used to enjoy a leading positions in Chinese market. In the industry like AI or those ICT industry, the leading companies, they generally take the majority part of this market. Any newly emerging markets, any newly emerging companies, for example, if Huawei want to produce some AI chips, the toughest part is how to persuade the markets to accept their products. If they can't, they cannot build a cycle, which means the investment, the profits from the markets, and more investment on the research. The main purpose of U.S. policies is want to slow down on China's companies and industry on these AI areas. But what they made is kind of export control. And then the Chinese companies, the Chinese markets cannot access to the latest or the most advanced, most sophisticated productions from companies like NVIDIA. And then at the same time, these markets lead to Huawei, make Huawei the possibilities to access markets and to develop their own productions. So you will find a very interesting phenomenon. On one aspect, the U.S. export policies raise tough challenges for the development of AI companies inside China, while at the same time, the same policies make it possible and make it necessary for Chinese companies make final decision that they have to develop some chips totally produced in an environment which will not intervene by U.S. export control policies. That finally leading the companies like NVIDIA suddenly have to face a nearly parallel competitors represented by Huawei companies. Those Chinese companies, they have huge amounts of talent engineering, and then they can access a very important, significant share of Chinese markets, usually monopolized by the NVIDIA companies, but cannot access because of U.S. government policies. The Chinese markets have the most important driving force to access the most advanced AI chips and technologies in the world. All these three things finally you will find that prove the point raised by Ren Zhengfei and Jensen Huang. It's only a time issues. When the time passing by, if the United States continually increasing their export control policies toward China, and to providing some help to Chinese companies like Huawei to produce their own AI chips, develop their own AI ecosystem, if China can survive during this policy, during this process. Finally, from China's side, we will have a relatively independent ecosystems from hardware to software, and these systems may be less advantageous in certain technical parameters, but it will have a very a very classical Chinese characteristics. It will have a very strong market advantages, and then United States will, the companies like NVIDIA will find that it will have the competitions not only inside Chinese markets, but also in the world, and the global markets will face the tough challenges and the competitors from companies from China at that time.
Well, let's say Washington's export control regimes may make Chinese tech great again. Who knows? Let's see. Paul, let me ask you about this. How successfully do you anticipate NVIDIA's launch of B30 CPU in China, given the fact that Andy has rightly pointed out that there have been changing goalposts when it comes to U.S. export control regimes, changing regulations, rules, 1 month from the next, one administration from the next. But Trump looks like he's approaching this in a far more transactional approach. For example, exporting to the UAE and Saudi Arabia some advanced chips in exchange for other things. How do you expect this NVIDIA's launch to be successful or not?
I agree with some of the other comments from Andy and Dr. Shen on sort of the bigger picture here. So I think it's important not to necessarily focus entirely on the B30. I think as I noted, it's a sort of evolutionary situation where NVIDIA has simply redesigned its some lines of GPU to comply with U.S. export controls. We still really don't know what the B30 will entail. But I think a good example of how Chinese companies have innovated around this is DeepSeek. So if we look at how DeepSeek developed and trained its V3 and R1 models, for example, those were trained on some NVIDIA H800 GPUs, which had been modified to reduce, as I noted, that GPU to GPU bandwidth. But what indeed it was innovate around the low-level software programming to sort of overcome that those limitations by figuring out how to maximize and optimize the different communication channels that exist between GPUs. And so just recently, for example, Huawei came out with a paper on its new cluster, the Cloud Matrix 384, which is really, I think, more important to talk about now than just individual GPUs. It's really now about networking and sort of systems architecture. And so the Cloud Matrix 384, for example, Huawei 910C processors, but they're networked together in a way to optimize the ability of the system to be used for training large language models or doing inference. And so Huawei, in the paper that came out just a couple of days ago, describes how it used some of DeepSeek's optimizations around, for example, the interconnectivity and the GPU to GPU transfers to achieve higher levels of performance. And so there's lots of different analysis of that system, but it compares favorably in many metrics to a similar system using the NVIDIA H100 GPUs, for example. And so when they're networked together like this, that will present a compelling package for Chinese companies to consider. And so again, I think Andy mentioned this is where Chinese companies are really going to be probably leaders in terms of actually deploying AI at scale at the enterprise level to leverage the internal data that they have to train these models. And that will be a really important part of the equation too, not just sort of the raw computing power, if you will, of individual GPUs.
Andy, let me ask you about this. How much of a containment strategy do you see Trump and his close-knit circles are following a few months into his second term? And how far do you think Trump would go, judging from his mixture of transactional approach versus the national security establishment insisting him on having this persistent long-term containment strategy vis-a-vis China?
Well, Wang Guan, I think from a political perspective, this is a very important question, and there seems to be two camps here in the Trump administration. So the first is that China is the main threat, and the U.S. needs to concentrate all of its resources to contain China. And this is perhaps best epitomized by people like Elbridge Colby, who's been articulating this approach for a number of years. On the other hand, I think the U.S. is getting pulled into other conflicts like the recent one between Israel and Iran. But I want to quickly point out here, to go back to this AI question briefly, we have to look at this, Juan, and say, look, if SMIC had access to ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, they would be a global leader, probably surpassing TSMC. If HiSilicon, which is Huawei's chip design company, had access to TSMC foundry manufacturing capability, it probably would be the global leader. In NVIDIA. So again, that if companies in China, including Huawei, had access to the entire stack of value creation, that we would see Chinese global leadership, possibly. So I think this then makes this. I called these speed bumps, but they are significant challenges, and I think China is overcoming them. One of the main reasons is that an interesting statistic: 50% of global AI talent is in China. So I think it's a matter of time. And what does this mean then? I think for the U.S. efforts, whether or not there is an agreement in the Trump administration and an ability to prioritize political objectives, I think it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to slow down China. And again, mainly because I think China has a systems engineering approach to solving these problems, whereas the U.S. takes more of a component approach. Let's block China on advanced semiconductors. Let's block China on foundries. Whereas China is able to adapt and recognize that these components in the system all interact with each other. And I think whether we're looking at electric vehicles, whether we're looking at high-speed rail, even space exploration, China's overcome enormous obstacles, I think largely because of its holistic systems engineering approach. And I would apply this to these political challenges as well, Juan.
Yeah, exactly. Professor Shen Yi, what is your take on the intensifying geopolitical rivalries given the addition of the unfortunate war between Israel and Iran? I mean, the United States has been pivoting back to Asia, thinly veiled strategy to contain China since as early as 2010, 2011, failed to do so. And now, given the tensions in the Middle East, what would be the implications for China-U.S. rivalry?
In 1960s, when JFK took the office, the U.S. national security strategies is based on an assumption that the United States can simultaneously afford 2.5 wars in the world, which means it can support, it can afford a kind of theater war in Europe with USSR at that time, a theater war in Asia with China, and while at the same time in Middle East or African, it can also support a 0.5, which means a kind of limitation war like Korean Wars. But since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. capacities, they cannot afford this 2.5 war. It can only afford a kind of one war, which means they need to pick up the major adversaries or competitors either in Europe, which means Russia, or in Asia, which means China. Since the first Trump administrations, definitely China become the major competitors or adversaries or targets of U.S. national security strategies. Just Guan, you mentioned that China and the United States want to launch a kind of new containment to China in certain aspect. But nowadays, changing geopolitical situations in the world make the United States face a very tough challenges, which means even though the United States want to solve all these issues, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine in Europe, the competition with China in Asia and globally, and also want to stable the Middle East situations and helping and ensure the surviving security of Israel, and so on. But the United States did not have enough sustainable resources to afford it. So you will find that the United States want to maintain its traditional hegemonic orders in today's world, while face those lots of challenges, and all his actions, including its involving exporting control policies, input more uncertainty elements in today's world systems. But at the same time, the limitation of the United States policy is also very clear. Maybe in future, after certain new turmoils, the U.S. need to admit its limitation of the capacities, and that there will have a new chance for United States and China to sit down when Washington have become more rational to face these challenges, to recognize the limitations of its capabilities and its resources, and then maybe we will see the emergence of new, more stable and sustainable situations between U.S. and China in a more general ways.
Hopefully things will stabilize sooner rather than later. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your insights, and that's all the time we have for this edition of The Hub. Thanks so much for tuning in. Our news coverage continues on CGTN. Bye and take care.